and welcome Clat Warriors. Hope you are doing well, studying well, preparing well and scoring really well. So moving on to our first passage. As a writer on physics, I am always seeking new metaphors for understanding Einstein's general theory of relativity, and while working on my last book, Spooky Action at a Distance, I thought I would compare the warping of space and time to the motion of Earth's tectonic plates. So the very first line of the passage starts with that writer is looking for some metaphor, new metaphor to explain Einstein's general relativity. Now, and he is saying that I would compare the warping of space like distorting or twisting, bending of space to time motion of Earth's tectonic plates. Now, Einstein explained gravity as the bending of space-time. Einstein ने कैसे compare किया? He compared bending of space-time to Earth's tectonic plates moving, right? A well-hit baseball arcs through the air of an outfielder's glove because it is following the contours of space-time which the planet Mars has reculpted. Now what is reculpted? Reshaped or changed in form. So in these lines author is saying that just like gravity makes object follow curved paths because space-time itself is bent, the Earth's surface also keeps shifting, so nothing has truly permanent position. He's saying the mutability of space-time. What is mutability? Ability to change. Also means that nothing in the universe has fixed position since the framework by which position is defined is fluid, and something like that is also true of Earth's surface. So author is saying कि जैसे universe में कोई भी चीज permanent या fixed नहीं है, it is continuously changing, and he is saying this for Earth's surface as well. Nothing on the ground has fixed coordinates because the landscape is ever shifting. तो author is saying कि continuously Earth का landscape बदल रहा है, बदलता रहता है, but then it struck me. If nothing has fixed coordinates यानी exact geographical points, right, longitudes, latitudes, then how do Google Map, car navigation system and all the other mapping services get you where you are going? So author is now asking question कि अगर किसी भी चीज़ के fixed coordinates नहीं है तो कैसे Google Maps या car navigation system या दूसरी mapping services हमको वही लेके जाती हैं जहाँ हम जाना चाहते हैं? Presumably they must keep updating the coordinates of places. Continuously वो coordinates को update कर रहे हैं क्योंकि Earth continuously move कर रही है, but कैसे? But how? I figured I would Google the answer quickly and get back to Einstein. Yet a search turned up remarkably little on the subject. So author is saying कि मुझे लगा कि मैं Google करूँगा और मुझे तुरंत इसका जवाब मिल जाएगा, but नहीं, उन्हें Google करने पे ज़्यादा कुछ भी नहीं मिला. Now, so as happens distressingly often in my life, like upsettingly, what I thought would take 30 seconds ended up consuming several days. जो मैंने सोचा था कि it will only take few seconds, it took him around several days. I discovered a sizable infrastructure of geographers, geologists and geodes. What is geodes? Scientists who measure Earth's shape and coordinates. ठीक है? Geodes, scientists who measure Earth's shape and these longitudes, latitudes, right, dedicated to ensuring that maps are accurate. So now he is saying that the search turned up remarkably little and it took him days, and he discovered that a sizable infrastructure of geographers, geologists and geodes dedicated to ensuring that maps are accurate, but they are always a step behind. See, they are always a step behind in the restless landscape. Geologic activity can create significant errors in the maps on your screen. So author is saying that he found that many experts work on keeping maps accurate, but since Earth's surface keeps on moving like earthquake, tectonic shift, maps can never be perfectly up to date. One of the people I talked to was Ken Hudnut. Now, of US Geological Survey, an earthquake researcher who had set up for the first GPS networks to track plate motions, say that you are standing right in the middle of road intersection with your GPS receiver and you get the coordinates for your position. You look at Google Earth and instead of being located right at the middle of road intersection, you are off by some amount, some centimeters. Several factors produce these errors. Consumer GPS, अब ये errors किस वजह से आती है? Consumer GPS units have position uncertainty of several meters or more. So author here is saying that Hudnut explained GPS can be inaccurate. अगर आप road के intersection में बीच में खड़े होते हो तो it might show you a few meters away from the actual spot. An error happen because of GPS devices aren't perfectly accurate and because maps and satellite images themselves can be slightly misaligned. Now, less known is that maps and satellites are typically misaligned by comparable amount. It is partly the GPS hardware that limits the accuracy. किस वजह से? Partly, not wholly, partly the GPS hardware that limits the accuracy, and part of it may also be the quality of georeferencing. All right. What is georeferencing? Like linking map images to actual Earth coordinates. ठीक है? Linking map images to actual Earth coordinates. And an interesting, if dated, study from 2008 looked at Google Earth images in 31 cities in the developed world and found position errors ranging from 1 to 50 meters. Right? It's not hard to do your own experiments. As technology progresses, so will we all. So author is saying that a study in 2008 showed that the Google Earth had location errors between 1 to 50 meters in different cities, and anyone can test and see such errors. Okay? As technology, we are fast approaching the day when people expect accuracies of centimeters in real time out of their handheld devices. We are expecting 100% accuracy, and then we will see a lot of head scratching as things no longer line up. Now, who is saying that? Drew Smith of National Geodetic Survey in Silver Spring, Maryland, the nation's civilian chief geodesist, the go-to guy on the precise shape and size of our planet. So in the last line, author is saying that technology is improving fast and soon people will expect more accuracy down to just a few centimeters. अभी जहाँ 1 to 50 meters की हो रही, few centimeters की accuracy चाहेंगे, and when that happens, even small mismatches between GPS and map will confuse people, right? And then it will be a very big issue. Who is saying that? Drew Smith. All right. So overall, this passage begins with a metaphor comparing Einstein's relativity and to Earth's tectonic plates moving, and this leads to another question ki agar if Earth's surface is always shifting, how do GPS and mapping systems stay accurate? And then author discovers that many scientists work on correcting maps, but still error still exists due to Earth's movement, and there are limitations in GPS devices and misalignment in maps. While technology is improving towards centimeter level accuracy, this will also expose even small mismatches, leading to new challenges in navigation. Alright, easy passage. Now moving on to the question and answer. Based on the passage, which inference best captures the author's overall perspective on the process of scientific investigation? Option A, he regards scientific inquiry as frequently exasperating due to its numerous obstacles and inconclusive outcomes. नहीं, author ने कहीं भी नहीं बोला कि it is irritating or exasperating, तो A is incorrect. He considers scientific research a laborious yet indispensable endeavor. Author ने उसको ये भी नहीं बोला कि it is a tedious task or it must be that must be endured. Right? The author is not saying that it is a tedious task or tedious chore. Like scientists seems to welcome these challenges, isn't it? The B is also incorrect. He embraces the unpredictable nature. Yes, he is embracing it, and integrate complexity of scientific exploration with genuine enthusiasm, because author starts with a metaphor about relativity, then small question about GPS makes him spend days researching. So he is not sounding frustrated, rather he is sounding amused and curious. So yes, C is the correct answer. He believes scientific pursuits ought to be restricted to scholarly environments and avoid public discourse. No, option D is like it suggests that science should be kept in universities only, but the author is writing a public book making science relatable to common man, relatable to readers. So D is also incorrect. Moving on to the next question. The author's references Ken Hudnut's work tracking tectonic plate movement using GPS networks to highlight a particular challenge. What deeper insight does the discussion of Hudnut's work primarily convey about the state of modern geospatial technology? So option 2 is asking us about insight from Ken Hudnut's GPS work, right? Option A, the steady movement of tectonic plates leads to profound and permanent global geographical disorientation, making navigation increasingly unreliable worldwide. आप ऑप्शन ए इज वेरी एग्जैजरेटेड, वो कह रहा है कि ग्लोबल नेविगेशन इज अनरिलायबल वर्ल्ड वाइड. ऐसा हमारे पैसेज में बिल्कुल भी नहीं कहा गया है, राइट? पैसेज जस्ट शोज एरर्स आर ओनली अ फ्यू मीटर्स, नॉट अ कंप्लीट ब्रेकडाउन. ऑप्शन इज वेरी एक्सट्रीम. Current earthquake prediction models fail to improve meaningfully, limiting geologists' ability to foresee geologic events despite enhanced GPS. Option B is talking about earthquake prediction models, which the passage never mentions. Hudnut is about GPS position errors, not any prediction. So B is irrelevant to the question. Despite advanced monitoring, mapping technologies inevitably lag behind a shifting surface, causing positional inaccuracies. Yes, Hudnut is explaining that even if you stand in the middle of a road, GPS might show you slightly off, and the passage says maps are always a step behind the restless landscape, the continuous moving earth. So C is the correct answer. Google Earth and similar map providers are fundamentally flawed. Basically मतलब उनका nature ही flawed है and consistently present distorted geographic information due to outdated data. Right? Passage never said this. Passage says error come from many factors: GPS hardware, georeferencing, tectonic shift. Right? सिर्फ ये उसने बिल्कुल नहीं बोला कि Google Earth fundamentally flawed है, तो it is also very extreme. Moving on to the next question. Which of the following best describes the function of rhetorical question in the line if nothing has fixed coordinates, then how do Google Maps, car nav system and all the other mapping services get you where you are going? So what is the function of this rhetorical question, right? It introduces a paradox that undermines the validity of general relativity. No, author is not questioning the validity of general relativity, rather than he is accepting it. So A is incorrect. He mocks the perceived simplicity. कोई भी mocking नहीं है, right? His tone is curious, his tone is enthusiastic, his tone is serious, not mocking. It offers a probable solution to a scientific dilemma. No, it is not offering any solution, right? It marks a shift from theory to technological application. Yes, D is the correct answer, because this rhetorical question, this moves the discussion from Einstein theory, relativity and tectonic plates to practical example like GPS, maps and those little errors. Right? So it marks a shift from theory to technological application. D is the correct option. Moving on to the next question. The author refers to his own rabbit hole experience. What is rabbit hole experience? कि he went, उसको लगा कि मैं गूगल करूँगा और कुछ सेकेंड्स में मुझे आंसर मिल जाएगा, but that research went on to days. So that was the rabbit hole, when you are so much consumed by some topic, right, कि you lose track of time. So the author refers to his own rabbit hole experience primarily to illustrate how easy it is to disapprove mainstream physics theories. So no, he is not trying to disapprove physics theories. Relativity remains untouched in his argument. So A is incorrect. Over-reliance on technology for answers undermines critical thinking and diminishes human problem-solving capacity. Nahin, he is not criticizing over-reliance on technology. Not at all, right? It celebrates, rather it is celebrating the curiosity, isn't it? Emphasize the depth and complexity of seemingly simple question. Yes, C is the correct answer because he thought that GPS question would take 30 seconds, but it took days, and this shows how small question open into complex network of knowledge. So C is the correct answer. Question the credibility of modern GPS system. No, he is not questioning GPS credibility. Instead, he explores why it sometimes shows errors. Because most of the times it is correct, right? Coming on to the next question. The author compares the mutability of space-time, continuous changing of space-time as described by Einstein's relativity with the shifting geography of Earth's surface to illustrate the challenges in geospatial accuracy. Given this analogy and the discussion of GPS and mapping errors, which of the following best captures a fundamental implication about our interaction with technology and physical reality? So it is asking about implication of relativity plus shifting Earth analogy, right? This physical relativity, implication about interaction with technology and relativity. Okay? So option 1, reliance on digital maps creates false spatial certainty, making Earth's ever shifting reality. Yes, A is the correct answer. The passage stresses that we think Google Maps gives us fixed points, isn't it? But in truth, Earth is shifting and maps are always a step behind. Our confidence in map is partly an illusion क्योंकि real time image हमको नहीं मिलती है. तो A is the correct answer. Technological system like GPS are inherently, very extreme word, unreliable, and their inaccuracies undermine their practical utility for navigation and geolocation. Option B is saying that GPS is unreliable and it is undermining its usefulness, but Pasher shows that GPS is very useful. It's just not it is not perfect, but it is very useful. So B is incorrect. वो उसको inherently unreliable, useless बोल रहा है. The fluctuating positions on Earth's surface render current and future technological mapping solutions and anachronistic. So option C is talking about that map solutions are obsolete, anachronistic बोल रहा है, out of the time, right? Which is very extreme. Technology keeps improving. हमारे passage में भी उसने बोला है. तो C is incorrect. Earth's geological dynamics necessitate that digital mapping must eventually be abandoned in favor of traditional analog navigation system, right? It suggests that we should abandon digital map for paper map, which passage never suggested, never said, right? So D is also irrelevant to the question. Moving on to the next question. In describing the discovery, that seemingly straightforward question about GPS coordinates consumed significant research time, the author uses the phrase a glitch in the matrix. What underlying message does the author aim to communicate with this metaphor regarding our reliance on geospatial technology? So question is about this glitch in the matrix metaphor. Now, option A says GPS and mapping technologies are inherently unreliable and frequently deceive users about their location. Option A, again, it doesn't mean GPS is frequently unreliable, error exists, but the system works well most of the time. So again, it is very extreme, right? Powerful external entities manipulate mapping technologies to control geographic information presented to the public. Option B is talking about external manipulation or conspiracies, जो कि हमारे passage में कहीं भी mentioned नहीं है. तो B is also incorrect. All modern technological systems, including GPS, are fundamentally flawed due to design limitation imposed by their creators. Again, C is also very extreme. It is not about design flaws. It is about natural earth shifts and technological limits, isn't it? So C is also incorrect. Yes, the correct answer is D. Such moments reveal the illusion of effortless precision, exposing hidden complexity and constant recalibration, constant adjustments, right? Because glitch in the matrix means a small mistake that shows the illusion is not real, right? Here it means GPS and maps look perfect, but actually there is a huge system working behind them, constantly adjusting to Earth's continuous changing nature. Alright, you see, I needed to go to hell. I was, you might say, homesick. But first, by way of explanation, the onion. A friend of mine owns a restaurant that is considered to be one of the best Italian restaurants in the New York. As is the case at most other Italian restaurants in Manhattan, the food is prepared by Dominican or sundry other fellows of more exotic and indiscernible, more judgmental ethnic origin, and this particular third world truffle joint where I take my lunch possesses the added cachet. ठीक है, indiscernible is like very hard to distinguish, hard to recognize. All right, and author is saying that this truffle joint, this is actually a sarcastic phrase for fancy food served in a fake ethnic setting. I take my lunch possesses the added cachet. What is here? Cachet is a prestige, special appeal of Cucina Toscana, invoking all American theme parks. Now, Cucina Toscana is an Italian cuisine, and we're invoking the all American theme park Florence, where today one would be hard pressed to find a Vero Fiorentino. What is Vero Fiorentino? Is true original Florentino, okay? Original Italian, amid the overcrowding herd of estivating. What is estivating? Tourists, like summer tourists who overwhelm the city. The city is crowded with the visitors, not the Vero Fiorentino, like the true Fiorentinos. That is Dante's Revenge. Now, यहाँ पे Dante's Revenge is again a sarcastic reference to Florence's overcrowding as a poetic punishment. All right, so in these lines author is saying that he opens up with the irony that need to go to hell, right? Like, means he chose to visit an overpriced pretentious restaurant. His friend owns so-called top Italian restaurant in New York, though the chefs are not Italian but Dominicans or from other backgrounds, and the narrator is describing a small restaurant in a developing country that serves fancy truffle dishes, and it claims to serve Tuscan cuisine, right? Cucina Toscana, Tuscan cuisine, and it gives it extra prestige, right? Added a cachet, right? And this reminds the narrator of Florence, Italy, but the Florence of today feels like a tourist theme park overcrowded with vacationers. So it's hard to find real locals, the true Italians, and the joke is that this situation, tourists taking over Florence, is Dante's Revenge, as if the famous poet would disapprove, right? All right, moving on to the next lines. Anyway, there I sit, I cannot help but see and hear what surrounds me as modish men. What is modish? Is a fashionable man raises glasses of wine and discuss balance, body, bouquet. So in these lines author is saying that he is observing fashionable customers drinking wine and pretending to be wine experts. My friend, the proprietor, like owner, is not a stupid man when it comes to business. He encourages them, engages them in a subtler points of their delusory expertise. Delusory expertise, like false sense of knowledge, and the smile on his face. He has sold them for several $100, would cost him far less. जो उसको बहुत ही कम कीमत में पड़ता है, वो several $100 में अपने customers को दे रहा है. Is to their purblind eyes, like एकदम lacking insight, एकदम अंधे हो रखे हैं. Both gratification and benediction. Gratification and benediction is like satisfaction, and they are lacking sight of both satisfaction and benefit, right? Blessing and acceptance of their expertise and knowing. So in these lines author is saying that his friend, the restaurant owner, cleverly flatters them, letting them think they know a lot, when in reality he is making a large profit out of them, right? So they lack that insight. तभी उसने use किया purblind eyes, right? And I sit and I ponder the onion that has been placed before me. For this particular onion bespeaks more than the whole of the effigy, the true nature. So again, bespeaks like representing, showing. Okay. Bespeaks, representing. The onion is representing more than the whole of the Uffizi. Uffizi is the famous art museum in Florence, and the true nature of Italian creativity more than the whole of Machiavelli, the true nature of Tuscan cunning. तो यहाँ पे Machiavelli is a Renaissance political philosopher from Italy, famous for The Prince. The Prince is his book. The true nature of Tuscan cunning. Tuscan cunning is a cleverness, street smart associated with Tuscany, right? So author is saying that this talking about single onion, but not just literally. He is saying that the sentence is saying that this onion somehow reveals or expresses something very important. The Uffizi, this famous art museum in Florence with countless masterpieces, yet author says that this single onion conveys the essence of Italian creativity even better than all art museum of Italy. Alright, so he is being again sarcastic, right? Now, again he is saying that this Machiavelli is the famous for writing The Prince, which explores political cunning and strategy, but this onion supposedly captures the real cunning of Tuscan people even better than Machiavelli's writing. So he has used two allusions, Uffizi and Machiavelli, to compare it with onion. Right? Now it is to be precise, not even an onion, merely half an onion. एक पूरी onion भी नहीं, आधी onion. But it is half a wala onion. This fact is flaunted, roasted and topped with smidgen of caviar. Smidgen, like very small amount of caviar, something which toppings में अपन रखते हैं, that is caviar. The price is $35 at the cost of a single 1 pound wala onion is about $1, and the cost of beluga caviar well under $25 an ounce. This half an onion and its smidgen must be worth about $5 or $6. It costs really less. This dish in reality costs really less, but कितने में बेची जा रही है? Around 35, और अगर caviar missing है तो around $25, right? Now, mysticized into a rare and precious delicacy by my friend, like it seems very, it is made to seem very mysterious or special by his friend who owns this restaurant. It is very popular item. Whenever the caviar runs out, the 50-cent half onion is served as a price of $10. And as I ponder the onion, my memory wanders back a quarter of century ago and more to this place before my friend took it over and made it into one of the great chichi joints of Manhattan. So in these lines, author is saying that the dish is just half a wala onion with a tiny bit of caviar on top, sold for $35, but in reality it is worth only few dollars at most. Yet by presenting it as something special, his friend convinces people to pay extravagant amount, right? And then he says that the speaker is remembering the restaurant decades ago when it was a private, low-key place for serious, discerning men, right? Chichi Joints is a pretentious, fashionable restaurant. He is saying कि इसके पहले जब it wasn't converted into Chichi Joint of Manhattan, it was a very low-key place जहाँ पे बहुत ही recognizable men आते थे, right? And if the old it was in those days a semi-private eating establishment adjoined whose patrons were mostly gentlemen of darkly taciturn sort. Taciturn is a silent, darkly silent sort. I can just imagine the gentry by whose name the place was known, setting before one of them half an American onion as if it were a treasure, and then suggesting not only that he pay for it, but that he pay 20-fold for it. It would have been the owner's, and for his truly were customers of worldly discernment. It is my friend's fortune that worldly discernment means refined judgment, sophistication, right? It is my friend's fortune that they are dying breed replaced by neo-caffeine of today. What is neo-caffeine? Neo-caffeine again is an Italian term often used in a humorous or critical way, and it means new, and caffeine is peasant, like who are not so sophisticated, right? Pretentious to be modern, fashionable or urban, and still displays behaviors, tastes or manners that are considered crude, not that sophisticated. All right, so author is saying that those older patrons had true taste and judgment. जब ये जो restaurant है वो change नहीं हुआ था, लेकिन अभी they have been replaced by superficial, gullible neo-caffeine who willingly pay overpriced for fake luxuries. So overall in this passage the narrator uses the onion dish as satirical symbol of modern pretentiousness in high end dining, जो एक restaurant once who catered to genuine gentry with real discernment, with real sophistication, but now fashion obsessed crowd pays absurd prices for simple foods dressed up as luxury. So, alright, and he used various metaphors and allusions to do the comparison, and this decline of authentic taste in favor of shallow trendiness. Like the author is criticizing this artificiality and cultural experiences. Alright, moving on to the question. Author का tone क्या है throughout? Is it nostalgic and admiring? ठीक है, nostalgic हम बोल सकते हैं when there is some nostalgia when he recalls about the old clientele, gentlemen of worldly sophistication and discernment, but he is not admiring, he is mocking it. Admiration is not the main tone. So A is incorrect. Indifferent and descriptive, no, he is not indifferent, he is very much engaged, he is not neutral, right? He is clearly judging, mocking, criticizing. See, mocking and critical, yes, the author mocks fancy diners who think they are wine experts and shows how ridiculous it is to sell half an onion for $35, and phrases like delusionary, expert, false knowledge, neo-caffeine of today. So alright, though all these words are mocking and critical, right? Objective and analytical, no, author doesn't seem to like, not fact-based explanation without feeling. His tone is very sarcastic, evaluative, not neutral. So D is also incorrect. Moving on to the next question. What is the best meaning of phrase purblind eyes as used in the sentence? The smile on his face is to their purblind eyes both gratification and benediction. Okay? The author is asking about the meaning of purblind, which we have already discussed. A, eyes filled with spiritual belief. Nowhere related to the meaning. This isn't about spirituality at all. Unseeing or lacking critical judgment. Yes, purblind literally means half blind. Like in context, it means the diners are blind to reality and they think they are being complimented, but really the owner is just making profit of them. So B is the correct answer. Completely blind due to excessive wine. It is a funny guess, but no, the blind here is metaphorical, not caused by any external thing, right? Or wine. Filled with suspicion and critique. No, this is opposite of what is happening. The diners trust too much. They are not suspecting the owner and they are paying whatever he is asking. Moving on to the next question. The author uses this neo-caffeine to describe a group of modern day customers. Based on this context, what is most likely meaning of term neo-caffeine? Question is about the meaning of neo-caffeine. Sophisticated? No. They are not sophisticated connoisseurs with refined taste. Rather that describe the old patrons, not the new ones. New ones ke liye to it is, they are not so sophisticated. So A is incorrect. Loyal traditional patrons who appreciate genuine quality. No, again that is for earlier clientele, not the new ones. New ones ke liye neo-caffeine istemal hua tha. Ignorant or uncultured newcomers, lacking discernment, lacking sophistication. Yes, C is the correct answer. Right? Caffeine is a derogatory Italian word for uncultured people. So C is the correct answer. A tourist fascinated by Italian culinary culture. It was stated in the very first paragraph. It wasn't related to neither this new clientele or the old gentry. Right? So D is irrelevant to this meaning. Moving on to the next question. The author's portrayal of half onion topped with caviar most closely resembles which of the following scenarios? ठीक है, यानी half onion with caviar is most like to which of the following option? A chef creating affordable meals for the homeless? No, यहाँ पे affordable वाली बात तो बिल्कुल भी नहीं है. That's absolutely charity and helping, not satire or price inflation. So A is incorrect. A luxury car dealership giving free test drive to attract customers. So B is marketing. It is not a trick, right? In value inflation. So B is also incorrect. It is not analogous to this particular example. A rare painting being underpriced at a flea market, ये underpricing होने की बात करें तो it is just the opposite of the whatever situation is presented in our passage. So C is also incorrect. A bottle of tap water being sold as artisanal glacier essence for $20. Yes, D is the correct answer. The onion itself costs less than $1 and caviar costs less than $25 an ounce, but together they are sold for $35. So the point is that cheap thing is disguised as luxury, same as selling tap water at an inflated price by branding it as rare. Right? So D is the correct answer. Next question. What idea can be most reasonably inferred about author's perspective on commodification of simple foods in high-end dining? So the question is about that, what is your inference about author's view on commodification of simple food, right? The author believes true culinary creativity shines through elaborate artful dishes showcased in prestigious museums like the Uffizi, right? But no, he does not claim that true culinary art lies in elaborate museum level dishes. He ironically says the onion teaches more than the Uffizi, right? So A is incorrect. He suggests true ingenuity, true cleverness is turning humble ingredients into pricey delicacies through perception. Yes, B is the correct answer, because he implies that creativity is not in food itself but making something cheap seem valuable. It's all about perception and marketing. So B is the correct answer. The author feels that the simple ingredient should remain inexpensive and accessible to preserve culinary authenticity. C, he does not argue onion should remain cheap. He critiques inflation but doesn't prescribe authenticity rules at all. So C is incorrect. He implies that high cost only reflect the quality and rarity of the ingredients rather than any exaggeration. Again, he clearly shows that price does not reflect rarity or quality, since the onion plus caviar cost only about $5 to $6 but is sold at $35. So D is also incorrect. Moving on to the next passage. Alright, how do you get to utopia? Utopia is imagine perfect society. You don't, of course, right? It's unreachably distant. Author is saying it is very far. Thomas More's Utopia and Francis Bacon's New Atlantis are set in what were then uncharted waters. Uncharted waters yani unexplored places. Unexplored places far enough away to have escaped both the attention and interference of the rest of the world. So author says that you cannot actually get to utopia. It is always unreachable. In older works like More's and Bacon's, these perfect societies were placed on far away, like unknown islands. That's what makes these islands for a moment plausible. No one can deny their existence with positive knowledge, and that's how they stay perfect. No one's colonized them, traded with them, influenced them in any way. So distance and difference were understood as directly relational. The greater the distance, the greater the difference. So author is saying that their remoteness made them believable and untouched by outside influence. Jitna dur, jitna different, the farther away they are, the more different they seemed. Alright. Now, and utopians are radically different. Granted, in some cases, the distance is temporal. We call these euchronias. What is euchronias? Perfect societies imagined in future. Euchronias, perfect societies imagined in future. So, author is saying here that some utopians are not in space but in time, right? The meaning, the perfect societies imagined in the future, but again, unreachable because no one lives long enough to see them. The point is, we will never get there, never live long enough, never see fiction turn to fact. जो हमने पढ़ा है, we will never see turning it into reality. Today's readers dimmer, too far-fetched, they complain, rejecting the distance. Others see utopias as prescriptive, rigidly so, even fascistic. People think of head in the clouds, dreamers or dogmatic philosophers king through. Frederick Jameson argues persuasively that utopias give us not blueprints but open-ended possibilities. Like at any rate, we now prefer dystopia. So author is saying that these fascistic यानी harshly authoritative, right? What does fascistic mean? Authoritarian है बहुत ज़्यादा. And Frederick Jameson, this allusion, he was a well-known cultural theorist and critic, and in this passage he is cited to show that utopia should not be seen as rigid plans, the blueprints for society. Okay, head in the clouds dreamers or dogmatic philosophers means people who are unrealistic or lost in fantasy or stubbornly sticking to a set of belief. Dogmatic philosophers king, right? So author is saying here that modern readers, however, reject utopia. Some utopians are not in space, unreachable because no one lived long enough to see them, right? And they think that they are unrealistic, too strict, or even authoritarian, right? Instead, people prefer dystopias, bad society. They prefer dystopias, distorted society. The Road, The Hunger Games and countless others, many adapted as films, such scenarios seem not distant but close, potentially imminent, and fans of the cult movie Idiocracy have already noted with horror the accuracy of its prediction. Our vulgar entertainment, the corporatization of everything, the dumbing down and worse of the highest office in the world. So what is corporatization? Like turning something into a commercial or corporate enterprise, right? Vulgar entertainment is like crude mass market entertainment, and he's saying the dumbing down and worse. What is dumbing down? Making something less intellectual, less sophisticated or simpler. Okay? Partially adjacent, because they are partially adjacent, like because almost immediately relevant or close to reality, not very distant. हमें ऐसा नहीं है कि we will be living long enough to see this, right? So author is saying that people relate with dystopia more than utopia, right? So in these lines author is saying that The Road or Hunger Games, which feel close and possible, films like Idiocracy even seem to predict today's problems, entertainment obsessed culture, corporate control and political decline. Like dystopias feel urgent because they seem right next door. It is not seeming something in fascination or in your dreams, right? But there are exceptions to the rule of utopian distance. So author is saying that utopia, not all utopias are far away. There are few exceptions. In the early history of novel, writers from Afra Ben to Jonathan Swift tried to bring utopia nearer. So these writers tried to bring utopia more nearer, tried to bring it back home to England. This was time of rambling adventure fiction, pseudo-true stories of merchants, pirates, captives and castaways all scattered to the four winds. In Gulliver Travels, for instance, Gulliver goes to Barbados and New Holland, but also the country of Houyhnhnms, a utopian land of naturally virtuous horses, and it at once a satire on tall tales and very serious philosophical provocation. So author says that in early novels like Afra and Swift and Daniel Defoe, they brought utopia closer to home, even to England, and adventure stories like travel, pirates, explorers. In Gulliver Travels, Gulliver visits real places like Barbados and Australia, but also a utopia of intelligent horses, the Houyhnhnms, and Swift used this both as a satire, like mocking tall travel stories and a deep philosophical ideas. Gulliver later returns home and tries to recreate these utopia with his own horses, avoiding any human, but Swift does not stop there. Gulliver comes home and recreates this Houyhnhnm society in miniature, shunning humans, avoiding humans for the company of horses in his stable. It is a plot pattern that recurs throughout the period, most notably in the novels of Daniel Defoe. So author is saying that this idea, this theme repeats in Defoe's novel that explores return home, bring lesson from distant adventure, right? So these people were trying to bring utopia nearer, closer, not far away. Best known as author of Robinson Crusoe, when we think of Crusoe, we remember his island. But at the end of novel, he too returns to England, bringing the ideal of peaceful stoicism with him. So in these lines, author is saying that Crusoe bring back stoicism, calm strength, right? In D4, Captain Singleton published a year later, eponymous pirate came back home with new notion of equality and communal prosperity. So in this line, author is saying that Singleton brings back equality and shared property. D4 teaches us the highest ideals can be merged with everyday life, and we can relocate utopia, make it practicable, rescale it to manageable proportions. So author is saying that D4's point is that utopia can be merged with daily life, made smaller and practical, not just far away. हम इसको recalibrate करके हम इसको पास ले आ सकते हैं. What's distance anyway when ships connect the Earth's farthest cover? Now author is asking कि with ships connecting the world, distance shrinks anyway. In D4's first novel, considered by some to be literature's first novel, Crusoe grows up in New York, wanting to see the world, believing fulfillment lies far from England. He gets enslaved by Barbary pirates, like captured by Barbary pirates. He grows tobacco in Brazil. At the end, he treks across the Pyrenees. Pyrenees is a mountain range between Spain and France, but he always wants more. An ill-fated voyage for slaves runs into a storm and strands him on his famous island. So author is saying that in Robinson Crusoe, often seen as the first English novel, the hero starts England dreaming of adventure. He goes abroad, he is captured by pirates, farms in Brazil, travels across Europe, and finally gets stranded on an island. At first, Crusoe bewails his loneliness, right? Bewails and he mourns or complains about his loneliness, but then he sets to work, retrieving supplies from the wreck, building a shelter and all manners of furniture, growing crops, drying grapes, spinning goats, even trying to his hand at beer making. For many pages, nothing happens but work, and still it's engrossing, and still it's very observing, it's very interesting. So author is saying that at first he is lonely and desperate, but then he adapts by working hard. He like salvaging goods from the wreck, building shelter, farming crops, and the story is long and full of daily labor, yet it keeps readers engaged because it shows how survival and purpose can come from steady work. So overall in this passage, it is contrasting utopia and dystopia, and traditionally utopias were imagined as far away in time or space, making them unreachable but inspiring. Lekin today dystopia feels more immediate and believable. However, early novelists like Swift, Defoe, they tried to bring utopia closure, showing how its ideals could be practiced in everyday life. Example में ये Defoe किया हुआ है that through work, endurance and practical adaptation, utopia can be rescaled, right, into reality, daily existence, rather than left as some distant fantasy. Why does the author discuss Jonathan Swift's Gulliver Travels and Daniel Defoe's novels in the context of utopian literature? Alright. To illustrate early English efforts to localize and simplify utopian ideals. Yes, this is option A is the correct answer, because passage says that English writers like Swift and Defoe tried to bring utopia nearer. Example में Swift's Gulliver visits an ideal society and then tries to recreate part of it in England, and Defoe Robinson Crusoe or Singleton shows how ordinary people living out utopian values in daily life. This shows that they localized utopia, made it smaller, practical and closer to reality, closer to home. So A is the correct answer. To show that Gulliver's Travels and Robinson Crusoe were purely escapist. No, the passage shows that they had serious philosophical and social meaning, not just fun adventure or escapist, right? To demonstrate the superiority of pirates and merchants as protagonists of utopian novels, no, because the point is not about who the characters are, it is about the ideas of utopia being lived. To C is also incorrect. To argue that utopian fiction has universally remained distant and impractical across history, this is very extreme, because the whole point is some writers tried the opposite. They tried to bring utopia closer, right? So it is not universally distant, हम उसको नहीं बोल सकते. Moving on to the next question. Which of the following best strengthens Frederick Jameson argument that utopias offer open-ended possibilities, right? Sorry. Utopian societies are always located on distant islands ensuring perfection. A is like this is the old model of utopia, not Jameson's open one, right? जो शुरू के first कुछ लाइन्स में मेंशन है. Dystopian literature provides darker, more thrilling narratives that feel realistic, engaging readers with urgent social and moral questions. Again, B is talking about dystopians, not utopia, so it is not supporting Jameson, right? So B is also incorrect. Some novels portray individuals applying utopian principles in practical ways. Yes, C is the correct answer. Jameson says that utopia is not a rigid plan, not a blueprint, but a space with possibilities, right? The passage shows Crusoe and Singleton applying utopian ideas flexibly in real life, and that supports the Jameson's point. That's open and possibility, right? All utopian texts are rigid and impose strict social order. D is the opposite of what Jameson is claiming, right? So D is incorrect. What is the central idea of the passage? Utopian fiction has always been unrealistic and detached from real human concerns. Option A is always unrealistic bolna. It is not true. The passage says some writers made them practical. They tried to bring them closer to the reality. So A is incorrect. Dystopians have replaced utopias because कहीं भी replacement की बात नहीं हो रही है कि something has replaced something. It is partly mentioned, but it is only one part of the passage. It is not the main idea. Utopia has shifted from distant fiction to something integrated into daily life. Yes, the passage begins with utopia as distant, utopia as unreachable, but by the time it comes to an end of the passage, it is more like it is shifting from far off fantasy to near and practical ideas, isn't it? Writers like Defoe and Swift rejected utopia in favor of practical philosophy. No, they did not reject it, they reshaped it, right? So D is also incorrect. Moving on to the next question. The passage discusses how modern audiences tend to reject utopia as too far-fetched and often prefer dystopias that seem practically adjacent. What inference about contemporary attitudes towards utopian and dystopian literature does the author most strongly imply? Right? So, option A. Contemporary readers often dismiss utopias, believing all form of speculative fiction unrealistic and detached from reality. Option A. It is talking about all speculative fiction dismissed, which is wrong. Only utopians or utopias are often dismissed, not dystopians, right? So A is incorrect. Now, dystopians resonate today by mirroring present anxieties and near future fears. Yes. Because in passage it is mentioned that modern audiences think utopias are too far-fetched, लेकिन जो dystopia है, like example दिया था उसमें The Road, The Hunger Games, Idiocracy, it feels close and imminent. Like this means dystopia work because they reflect current and their near future problems. So C is the correct answer. B is the correct answer. See, utopias are generally favored because they provide inspiring blueprints for society. Option, it's about utopias inspiring blueprints. So this is also incorrect because the passage stresses utopias are criticized for being rigid and too prescriptive for inspiring blueprints, right? So C is incorrect. Modern readers overwhelmingly value fiction that presents rigid and prescriptive social orders. So readers like rigid social orders? No, that's exactly what makes readers reject utopia. They do not like this blueprint, they do not like this rigid and prescriptive social order. So D is also incorrect. Coming to next passage. Like many natural language terms, consciousness is polysemous. Like what is polysemous? Like having multiple meaning, having multiple, albeit although related meanings, but multiple meanings. In one sense of the term, consciousness is a synonym for wakefulness. Consider, for example, the following sentence taken from the Logic of Definition by Scottish philosopher W. L. Davidson. The mind's wakeful activity is consciousness as opposed to dormancy, dreamless sleep, swoon, insensibility. So what is swoon? Fainting or passing out, right? Insensibility is like lack of awareness or feeling. Dormancy is like inactive state, like a state of sleep. Okay? So in these lines, author is saying that the word consciousness has many related meanings. In one sense, it just means being awake, but this philosopher described consciousness as wakeful activity of mind, the opposite of being asleep, fainted or unconscious, right? It is clear, however, that debates about the distribution of consciousness aren't about wakefulness. Author is saying that when people debate consciousness today, they are not talking about wakefulness. When the computer scientist Geoffrey Hinton claims that AI systems are already conscious, he isn't suggesting that they are awake, right? Conversely, those who reject the possibility of neonatal consciousness, neonatal related to newborn baby, neonatal consciousness don't deny the obvious fact that neonates undergo periods of wakefulness, but if the distribution problem isn't about wakefulness, what is it about? This distribution of consciousness is the question of who or what has consciousness, human, animal, machines, who has that consciousness. So in these lines, author is saying that he is giving example कि when just Geoffrey says that AI might be conscious, he doesn't mean AI is awake. Or similarly, when people argue whether newborn babies are conscious, they aren't denying babies wake up. They are asking about something deeper than just wakefulness, right? There are two strategies for answering this question. Now author is saying there are two main strategies in explaining consciousness. One strategy appeals to synonyms, bits of language that purportedly capture the intended meaning of consciousness. So author is saying that one is to use synonyms, words like awareness, sentience or subjective experience. Popular synonyms of consciousness like awareness, sentience, right? What is sentience? Is ability to feel and perceive, ability to feel and perceive. Subjective experience like personal first-hand experience. Another frequently invoked synonym is the phrase popularized by philosophers Thomas Nagel, to be conscious is for there to be something, it's like to be you. And then it says that being conscious, another is that philosopher Thomas added the phrase for being conscious means there is something, it's like to be you, like feeling of being a conscious object, something unique about you. Okay? This is definition by pointing consciousness is the taste of a lemon, the blueness of the sky. Appealing to synonyms may help to clarify what is it that we are not talking about, but there are serious limits on how much illumination we should expect from this approach. For one thing, if a term or phrase really is synonymous with consciousness, then it should be as mysterious as consciousness itself, in which case it is hard to see how helpful appeals it could be possibly be. So author is saying that these synonyms only take you from one word to another. They do not really explain what consciousness is. If synonyms are truly equal to consciousness, they are just as mysterious, not so much of help. Like what we want is a link from language to reality, not just from one word to another word. Author is saying that synonyms take you from one piece of language to another, but what we really want is something that takes us from language to some aspect of reality, some aspect of experience, right? Not just jumping from one word to another. Illumination, much clarity. We are expecting much clarity. This is where the second strategy of defining consciousness enters the picture. Don't know what consciousness means. So author is saying that now that's where the second strategy comes in, definition by pointing. Now this it is the experience of dark and light, the sound of clarinet, the smell of mothballs, the felt quality of emotion, the experience of a stream of consciousness thought. Its experience is associated with tasting elements, smelling a rose, or hearing a loud noise, it's the pain felt after a brick has fallen on a bare foot, or the blueness of the sky on a sunny summer afternoon. So author is saying that this definition by pointing, this philosopher like Davis and Frank Jensen says consciousness is the taste of lemon, what you taste, the smell of a rose, the sound of this clarinet is a musical instrument, the pain of stubbing your toe, the blueness of the sky. Instead of using synonyms, they point to examples of conscious experiences. So one approach was just jumping from one word to another, one synonym to another, and another is to tell it through experiences. Right? Now this is definition by pointing. इसको हमने क्या बोला? This is definition by pointing. Instead of explaining what consciousness means by relating it to another piece of language, one captures it by meaning, its meaning by relating it to something non-linguistic. हम एक word को दूसरे word से नहीं समझा रहे हैं, हम किसी experience से समझा रहे हैं which is non-linguistic. The experience of dark and light, the taste of lemon, the blueness of sky on a sunny summer afternoon, right? So the second method feels more natural and convincing, right? But how does it work exactly? What kind of understanding of consciousness does pointing actually give us? Author is saying that this is intuitively compelling, like this feels naturally very compelling. This feels naturally very convincing, but how exactly does it work? ये काम कैसे करता है? Right? What kind of insight, what kind of deep understanding into consciousness might it deliver? क्या दे रहा है? One widely held belief is that attending to examples of conscious experience enables one to grasp its essence. The idea here is not that we can tell whether something is conscious merely by attending to our own experiences. So in these lines, author is saying that one popular view is by focusing on examples of experience, you can grasp the essence of consciousness. Rather, the idea is that attending to our own experiences enables us to grab the concept of consciousness, right? And grasping the concept of consciousness in turn reveals what is to be conscious. Author is saying that you can grasp the essence of conscious. It's like understanding the triangles as a parallel. Consider what is involved in grasping the concept of triangularity. Understanding the triangle. If you have grasped the concept of triangle, then you know what it is to be a triangle. We might call this the manifest understanding of consciousness. Manifest, like obvious, clear understanding of consciousness, for it holds that pointing to example of consciousness make manifest its nature. So author is saying here that understanding triangle, you have grasped the concept, that you know what it means to be a triangle. Similarly, paying attention to your own experiences can help you understand what consciousness itself is, and this is called manifest. Right? Author ने इसको क्या बोला? Manifest. There is much more that is appealing in this conception of consciousness. Author is saying कि it has more into it, right? As countless philosophers have pointed out, introspective access to your own experiences does seem to provide us with direct access to the very nature of consciousness, but for all that, the manifest account of consciousness may well be wrong to see why consider jazz. So author is saying that this manifest view has appeal, because when we look inside ourselves, it feels that we are conscious, that we see consciousness directly. But what if we might be wrong to see? He is saying that let's consider the jazz. Suppose that someone asks you what jazz is, rather than attempt to define jazz by providing synonyms, you are more likely to point to instances of genre. So author is saying कि अगर आपसे कोई पूछता है कि jazz क्या है, तो you wouldn't be giving another synonyms to it. Instead you will tell your personal experience. You will point out there, you might say to your audience as you put on say Ella Fitzgerald's Like Someone in Love, Miles Davis Kind of Blue, or John Love Supreme, that is jazz. So you will point out examples, instances that you yourself have experienced, right? As the philosopher Ned Block once noted, the question what is consciousness can be answered much like Louis Armstrong reportedly answered the question what is jazz, if you got to ask you ain't never gonna get to know. So author is saying here that this philosopher Ned Block compared this to consciousness, this jazz, and Louis Armstrong even said that if you got to ask what jazz is, you will never know. The idea is that jazz, like consciousness, seems to be defined best by examples, by experiences. But the debate wasn't about who had played what notes first, but whether what they had played qualified as jazz. कि उन्होंने जो बजाया है, is it a true jazz, right? So author is saying कि unlike triangles, jazz is not a fixed concept, right? History shows that what counts as jazz has been debated, right? But although treating jazz as a manifest concept is undeniably tempting, it is as odds with the historical record. What counts as jazz, even as a bad jazz, has been a matter of debate, some of it's humorous, much of it's heated since its very beginning. So author is saying that unlike triangles, jazz is not fixed concept, and history shows what counts as jazz has been always debated. Even bad jazz was controversial. So this suggests that just pointing to examples doesn't always give us the essence of something. Consciousness might be like that too. तो ऑथर ओवरऑल वो जो सेकेंड थियरी थी उसको भी अब यहाँ पे वैलिडेट नहीं कर रहा है. तो इन दिस पर्टिकुलर पैसेज author has explored different ways to define consciousness. एक वो he told us using synonyms like awareness, sentient, and but this doesn't solve the mystery. Another way is definition by pointing, like giving examples of experiences like pain, color, sound, and this feels convincing to many philosophers. But it shows the essence of consciousness. But फिर आखिरी में he puts the example of jazz, suggesting this may not work. This second approach may not also work. Just pointing to examples doesn't necessarily reveal the true nature of concept or true nature of essence or consciousness of that particular thing. So we did not get any particular answer, right? Moving on to the question. Which of the following best captures the attitude of passage towards the manifest understanding of consciousness? It is rejected entirely for failing to address the complexities of consciousness. It is not rejected entirely. The author says it is tempting and has some appeal. पूरी तरीके से reject नहीं किया. It has some appeal. It offers finality in defining consciousness. No, हमें कोई भी finality भी नहीं मिली. There is no claim that it offers finally or wide support or endorsement. So B is also incorrect. Its reliance on introspection renders it wholly subjective and thus philosophically irrelevant. It is not dismissed as irrelevant. The passage takes it seriously but sees its limits as well, right? So C is also incorrect. The approach is seductively straightforward, offering only an illusion of genuine understanding. Yes, D is the right answer because passage says that manifest understanding seems appealing and give direct access to the nature of consciousness, but it also warns the manifest account may well be wrong. This means it looks convincing but may not actually explain the true consciousness. That's exactly seductive but illusionary, right? Moving on to the next question. In the passage, the author's primary objection to using synonyms in attempts to define consciousness is that, like, objection to using synonyms. Option A says synonyms often introduce further linguistic confusion, making precise definition unattainable. It's not about confusion or impossibility of precise definition. Is it capturing the true essence? The question was that. The use of synonyms demonstrate how language constructs overlapping meanings, suggesting that consciousness itself is essentially a semantic illusion created through words. Again, B, author never say that consciousness is just a trick of language, so B is also incorrect. They merely substitute one mystic term for another, leaving the underlying nature obscure. Yes, passage says that if a term really is synonymous with consciousness, then it should be as mysterious as consciousness itself. This means swapping consciousness for awareness or sentience does not help. It just replaces one mystery with another, one word with another, without uncovering its true essence, right? Option D, synonyms obscure rather than clarify debates by expanding scope of disagreement. Option D, the problem is not about expanding debates but failing to get closer to reality, get closer to the correct answer. So D is also incorrect. Moving on to the next question. The ultimate message of the passage conveys about efforts to define consciousness can best be summarized as: more serious attempts at defining complex concepts often collapse into circular reasoning and unavoidable conceptual dead ends. So, option A is pessimistic. The tone is not fully pessimistic in our passage. The author doesn't say all efforts collapse. It's very extreme. So, A incorrect. Each definition reveals aspects of the phenomena while exposing its limit. Yes, B is the correct answer, because the passage shows that synonyms partly clarify but remain circular. Okay? Definition by pointing feels natural, but it doesn't give the essence. So each approach gives insights, but it has own limits. So B is the correct answer. Philosophical consensus has nearly been reached by adopting manifest understanding. No philosophical consensus exists at all. So C is incorrect. Definitional debates are unproductive compared to scientific experimentation. The passage does not prefer science over philosophy. It sticks to conceptual debates. So D is irrelevant. Question number 19. According to the passage, what essential function does definition by pointing serve in discussion about consciousness? Okay. Option A, it exemplifies a method for arriving at universally accepted criteria for consciousness. No, it does not create a universal criteria. It is still challenged. It has its own limitation, right? It systematically dispels philosophical doubts about the notion of consciousness through empirical evidence. No, it does not solve all doubts with observational or empirical evidence. So B is also incorrect. It demonstrates how lived experiences can ground linguistic concepts in non-linguistic realities. Yes, C is the correct answer, because author says that instead of explaining by words, one captures its meaning by relating it to some experience like taste of lemon, blueness of sky. That's grounding language in lived reality. So C is the correct answer. Definition by pointing. It enables one to replace subjective biases with objective standards. No, it doesn't remove subjectivity. It actually uses subjective experience to define that, right? Moving on to the next question. How does the analogy between jazz and consciousness operate within the argumentative structure of the passage? Okay, analogy of jazz and consciousness. It illustrates that both domains have evolved clear, uncontested parameters through historical debates. Bilkul galat hai. The passage stresses on ongoing debates. There is no clarity, no consensus, right? So A is incorrect. It suggests that disagreement in both cases arises primarily from the inherent ambiguities and imprecision of language. The problem is not just language ambiguity but conceptual disagreement. It is just talking about the imprecision and multiple meanings from language, right? It highlights that expert consensus is both necessary and sufficient for resolving conceptual ambiguity. Again, the problem is not about just expert consensus. No suggestion that expert consensus resolve the debate, right? Expert consensus is both necessary and sufficient for resolving. कोई भी expert consensus की बात नहीं हुई है in resolving this debate. It underscores that pointing to paradigm cases sometimes fails to settle disputes about the essence of concept. Yes, D is the correct answer. The passage says with jazz, people point to examples like Miles or Coltrane, but argument about what counts as jazz still continues. Similarly, pointing to examples of consciousness might not reveal its true essence, right? So D is the correct answer. Moving on to the last passage. The heiress wanted to meet the Dalai Lama. Okay. Heiress is a rich woman who inherits wealth, right? Heiress wanted to meet the Dalai Lama. She wanted the Dalai Lama to be her friend. Okay. She had been obsessed with him for 2.5 years. I was literally in my bedroom one day listening to his tapes and thought to myself, wow, this guy is amazing. Sarah Bronfman told an Albany AM radio host last year. When His Holiness arrived, when Dalai Lama arrived in town the next day, Miss Bronfman could take credit for his presence. So this rich heiress, Sarah Bronfman, wanted to meet Dalai Lama and become his friend, and she had been obsessed with him for about 2.5 years. And she said in radio interview that one day she was listening to this audio tapes and thought he was amazing, and the very next day when Dalai Lama came to her town, she felt proud that this was the reason behind his visit. During her dilettantish, what is dilettantish? Like amateurish, not so serious, okay? Shallow involvement. During her dilettantish early 20s, Ms. Bronfman continued, she never would have conceived of such an ambition, but for the previous 5 years, she had been immersed in Executive Success Progress, a self-help regimen administered by the local organization Nexium, pronounced Nexium. It was an experience she found singularly emboldening. So, emboldening means giving courage or confidence, right? Self-help regimen is a structured program meant to improve your life, yourself. So in these line, author is saying that in her early 20s, she lived like a very shallow, aimless life, not so serious, and at that time she could never have imagined having such a big ambition. But in last 5 years, she had been deeply involved in something called Executive Success Program, which was self-help program run by a group named Nexium, and this program gave her confidence, right? Miss Bronfman sensed a connection between Dalai Lama's teaching and her training. मतलब इन्हें लगता है कि there is a connection between Dalai Lama's teaching and whatever she is taught through this program, and the way he looks at things is very scientific and very much in line with philosophy of Nexium. She told the host, and she is saying that she felt that Dalai Lama teaching was similar to what she has learned in Nexium, and she thought of introducing the Dalai Lama to Keith Raniere, the leader of Nexium, whom she saw as both a scientist and philosopher. She is telling, I said, well, that kind of sounds like what we do, and I thought maybe I could introduce myself and bring him here and introduce him to Keith, because I think Keith is a scientist and a great philosopher. So according to this Bronfman, Miss Bronfman, this Keith, who is the head of this Nexium group, is a scientist and a great philosopher, and he wants both of them to meet. Moving on to the next line. Now, Miss Bronfman was referring to Nexium founder Keith Raniere, a bespectacled 49-year-old with graying shoulder length hair. Mr. Raniere, who goes by the moniker Vanguard. Moniker is like a nickname or title. Vanguard, who is ahead of his times. So, who goes by the moniker Vanguard, he is known as Vanguard, bills himself as leader in human potential development, right? And has trademarked a philosophy he calls the rational inquiry method. He has trademarked this philosophy, rational inquiry method. He is what you would get, said one former associate, if David Koresh and Bernie Mukia, now one of the former associate is describing this Keith character, if David Koresh and Bernie Madoff had a child over the past 7 years, Mr. Raniere has earned the devotion of Sarah Bronfman and her sister. So, how his character is defined? This David Koresh is a symbol of religious manipulator, right? And this Bernie Madoff is a con man, like symbol of scam, money fraud. So now you understand that you have got the point of the character of Mr. Keith. So over the past 7 years, Mr. Raniere has earned the devotion of Sarah Bronfman and her sister Claire. In that time, according to his former girlfriend, according to Keith's former girlfriend and financial advisor, Barbara Bauchi, Mr. Renier has also squandered more than 100 million of Bronfman's liquor fortune, destabilizing one of the New York's most prominent business and social dynasties. So here author is saying that this people knew him like he was a mix of cult leader and a financial fraudster, and his girlfriend is telling that over 7 years Sarah Bronfman and her sister Claire became his loyal follower, but according to his girlfriend, who is also the financial advisor, Renier wasted more than 100 million of Bronfman family fortune, right? Now in NXIVM's arcane system, what is arcane? Mysterious, secret hard system of ranking members by colored sashes and stripes. Miss Bauchi ascended to 4th stripe of the group's green sash tier in ascending order to rank the NXIVM awards yellow, orange, green, purple and blue sashes. ठीक है, वो green तक आ गई हैं. As such, she is the highest ranking of Mr. Renier's disciples to defect publicly from the group. For years I was telling them that the scarves, the stripes, all the weird stuff needed to go. I mean, come on, the Boeing, there were a lot of good things about NXIVM and we were turning people off the weirdness. So author is here pointing out that NXIVM had this ranking system where members wore colored sashes, and Barbara Bauchi rose to the 4th strip to the green sash, which made her one of the highest ranking members. But she later left the group and criticized the strange practices like bowing and wearing scarves, and saying these weird rituals turned people away. Like, even though she is defected, she was legally barred from openly talking about the Bronfman sister who sued her for financial and privacy issues. Here, there was a restraining order. Bars Miss Bauchi from speaking publicly about Bronfman's sister, who have sued her for breach of fiduciary duties and invasion of privacy. But in an affidavit made public in January, she said the sisters had ceded more than $100 million to Mr. Renier and his executive success operation. So author is saying that like in a affidavit, in a sworn legal statement, Bauchi revealed that Bronfman's sister gave more than 100 million to Renier and his group, and $65 million alone bankrolled what Miss Bauchi has Mr. Renier's former commodities broker Yuri Plyam described in court documents at a pathological day trading addiction. What is pathological addiction? Uncontrollable obsession, like harmful habit, right? Another $25 million financed the partial construction of 26 homes in Los Angeles at the peak of housing bubbles, and in a now stalled joint venture with Mr. Plyam, who like Ms. Bauchi has since declared the bankruptcy amid increasingly convoluted legal dispute with Bronfman. What is convoluted? Like very complex legal dispute with Bronfman's and other associate of Mr. Renier. So in these lines, author is giving us more detail that another 25 million went into building like 26 houses in Los Angeles during housing bubble, and the project failed and stopped midway. Bauchi and other associates, Yuri Plyam, who had been in the investment, both went bankrupt like when you are unable to pay your debts, and then they entered complicated lawsuits with Bronfman sisters and other NXIVM members. So overall, this passage explains how Sarah Bronfman, who is a wealthy heiress, became obsessed with Dalai Lama but was influenced heavily by controversial NXIVM group and its leader Keith, and through her and her sister Claire's loyalty, Renier managed to control and waste over $100 million of their family fortune in risky financial schemes and failed real estate projects. And the story highlights the manipulation, cult practices and financial destruction caused by NXIVM under Renier's leadership, right? Moving on to the question, what is the primary focus of the passage? Okay, Sarah, Bronfman's spiritual motivation stemmed from seeking purpose, peace and personal growth through Nexium teaching and community. So option A is partly true, but it only covers her personal reason for joining Nexium. The passage is not mainly about her peace or growth, it is about Rainier's influence and financial damage as well, right? So it is only partly covering the central idea or essence of the passage. So A is incorrect. The similarities between Nexium philosophy and Buddhist teaching. So again, Sarah herself mentioned a connection between Dalai Lama and Dalai Lama's teaching and Nexium, but this is just one small part. The passage moves quickly to Rainier's power and misuse of money. और ऐसा Bronfman को लग रहा था कि they have some similarity. ऐसा passage में कुछ भी ऐसा नहीं. That is not the main central idea. Keith Rainier exerted suspicious financial and social control over the Bronfman sister through Nexium. Yes, C is the correct answer, because passage tells us that the Sarah Bronfman taking interest in the Dalai Lama, but the main story is about how Keith and Nexium group controlled Sarah and Claire Bronfman and wasted more than 100 million of their fortune. So this shows his social control and financial control, right? So C is the correct answer. The Dalai Lama's visit to Albany and its broader implication. So the Dalai Lama's visit is just starting anecdote, not the main story, right? Moving on to the next question. Based on the passage, what can be inferred about Nexium's internal hierarchy system? So, it was designed to motivate financial contributions from its members. Nowhere does the passage directly say that the stripes or ranks made people pay more money. वो सिर्फ hierarchy में ऊपर या नीचे थे. तो A is incorrect, right? We cannot infer it. It's functioned more like a religious order than a corporate organization. Again, B is also incorrect, because Boeing and sashes sound religious, but text doesn't say that Nexium was religious. It was more about power and control, right? So B is also incorrect. It served to establish a rigid power structure and inspire loyalty. So yes, C is the correct answer. The passage says that Nexium had colored sashes and stripes and even bowing rituals, and these are the signs of a strict ranking system where members could clearly see who was higher and lower. The kind of system strengthens loyalty and authority. So yes, C is the correct answer. It was modeled directly on Buddhist monastic system. नहीं, कहीं भी नहीं है ऐसा. The passage never links Nexium ranks to Buddhism. The Dalai Lama was part of Sarah's personal idea, not Nexium's structure, right? Moving on to the next question. The description of Keith Rainier as what you would get if David Koresh and Bernie Madoff had a child suggests that he is, one was a con man and one was a cult manipulator. तो देखते हैं, charismatic religious figure with political ambitions. No, A is incorrect, because Rainier isn't said to have a political goals. Someone who wanted to help others but failed publicly. Again, B is also incorrect. This softens the meaning. The comparison shows that he was dangerous, manipulative. It is not a failure. A misunderstood genius with poor financial planning. C is also incorrect, because it is also mild. He wasn't just bad at planning, he knowingly wasted millions, right? So C is also incorrect. Both a manipulative cult leader and financial fraudster. D is the correct answer. Very explicit. What rhetorical strategy does the author employ by opening with the anecdote about Sarah Bronfman and the Dalai Lama? So option A, trivialize her obsession and mock spiritual seekers. No, कहीं भी mocking की बात नहीं हुई है. The author doesn't make fun of people who genuinely seek spirituality. He just uses Bronfman's obsession as a story opener. He is not trivializing or mocking, right? Contrast genuine spirituality with Nexium manipulation. No, it is not about, it implied later, but it is not the purpose of opening anecdote. Okay? The question is about that anecdote. Okay? Draw the reader in with an unusual and surprising hook. Yes, C is the correct answer. The writer starts by describing a wealthy heiress who thinks she can bring the Dalai Lama to meet her self-help guru, and that's surprising and unusual. It instantly makes the reader curious and engaged, so it's a hook to set up the rest of the story. बाद में हमें क्या मिला कि
Nexium was a manipulator or something like that is a different thing, but the question is about that opening with anecdote about Sarah Brahmins and Dalai Lama to create a hook to draw the reader in with an unusual and surprising hook, right? Illustrate how the Dalai Lama endorses Nexium principles. No, definitely wrong. Dalai Lama never endorsed Nexium at all, right? So now we have come to an, so C is the correct answer. Come to an end of this analysis video. Hope you have understood all the passages and the explanation of each and every answer. Thank you so much, and all the best for your next, all the upcoming mocks and everything, and stay logical with Vidya.